Welcome back. Let's think about consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss when a tax is put in place, and see if we can identify the areas in our supply and demand diagram. So to do this, we're going to make a mess of a diagram. So I think if you're going to draw this, draw it large on your paper so you have space to label areas. So here's sort of what it looks like. All right, if we think about quantity, price, throw in a supply curve, throw in a demand curve, and let's label in our initial prices. So if we start out, we'll call this P naught. That's the amount that a good sells for without a tax in place. And then the government comes along, puts a tax in place that drives a wedge between the buyer and the seller. So the demand curve and the supply curve are separated by the amount of the tax, which means now the buyer is paying more than before, so we'll call that P sub B, and the seller is receiving less than before. So we'll call that P sub S. All right, let's go ahead and label some areas into our diagram. So let's call this top triangle area A, and the rectangle below it, we'll call that B. And this triangle to the right of B, we'll call it C. And then the triangle below B, let's call it D. And this triangle to the right of D, we'll call that E. And this lower triangle, F. So basically, we're just labeling across A, B, C, D, E, and F. So where do we see consumer surplus and producer surplus with a tax, without a tax? Let's try and make sense of this. So let's start without the tax. Right? So without the tax, we need to know consumer surplus and producer surplus. So what's consumer surplus without the tax? It's how much the consumer values the good, the demand curve, minus what they pay for it, the price. So it's the difference between the price and the demand curve. So consumer surplus is area A plus B plus C without the tax. What about producer surplus? Well, producer surplus is the difference between what a producer would be willing to sell at and the price that they actually sell at. So producer surplus without the tax is equal to D plus E plus F. So what's total surplus then? The total gains from trade. So total surplus is equal to A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F. Right? It's all the consumer surplus and all the producer surplus. The total gains from trade are the gains to the consumer and the gains to the producer. But now let's think about, well, what's happened once the tax is put in place? So with the tax, now what's consumer surplus and what's producer surplus? So consumer surplus with the tax put in place is the difference between what the buyer would be willing to pay, the demand curve, and what they pay. So that's P sub B, right? So consumer surplus now is just area A. And what about producer surplus, right? How much are the gains to the producer? Well, it's what they'd be willing to sell for, the supply curve, and what they sell for, or actually put in their pocket, P sub S. So producer surplus is just area F. What's missing? What happened to areas B and D? So those are our tax revenue, right? The difference between what the buyer pays and what the seller receives, this wedge between those two, that's the tax, times the quantity, the tax times the quantity, oh, that's the tax revenue, right? So our tax revenue So our tax revenue is equal to area B plus D. So our consumers lost area B to tax revenues paid. Our producers lost area D to tax revenues paid. So what's our sort of gains from trade with the tax? Right? So our gains, including producer surplus, consumer surplus, and the government's gains, their tax revenues. What does that work out to be? Well, it works out to be A plus F plus B plus D. Wait, so if we take total surplus and we compare it to that surplus or the gains from trade with the tax in place, what happened? Well, we ended up with a loss of areas C and E. So why did C and E disappear from our total surplus? Well, if we think about it, what happened to the amount of trade taking place? So our initial equilibrium and our quantity of trade with the tax put in place, there's less trade taking place. If there's less trade taking place, then there are less gains from trade. Those loss of the gains, because the tax reduced the amount of trade, that's this loss of C and E. That's what economists call deadweight loss. If trade is good, less trade isn't as good. This reduction in trade is a deadweight loss of C and E. Yes, I know it's a messy diagram for sure, but I bet if you look at it for a few minutes, you can see consumer surplus, producer surplus, tax revenues, and you can understand why the deadweight loss is there. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.